Hey, listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we have Dr. Fleet Maull, a renowned meditation teacher, author, and social entrepreneur whose transformative journey from federal prison to global leadership exemplifies the power of inner change. Maull is the author of Radical Responsibility, How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Your Highest Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good, a guide that integrates neuroscience, mindfulness, and personal development as part of his Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness, a trauma-informed approach to meditation that accelerates healing and personal growth. And today we're going to talk about the overlap of Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness with psychedelic work. Now, Fleet is also the founder of the Heart Mind Institute, which I spoke on a couple years ago for their online summit. And they also have a psychedelic practitioner community, the Psychedelic Practitioner Academy, that we will speak about today. So, Fleet, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Paul. Great to see you again.
It's good to see you as well. So you've described your time in prison as a kind of monastic training ground. And I'd love to start there in terms of how do you see the inner work of incarceration and meditation intersecting with the transformative potential of psychedelics?
Wow, that's a big question right there. Yeah, so the monastic part, I actually did take monastic vows for the whole time I was in prison in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But the parallel between prisons and monasteries is a very thin one. Other than the fact that you have a pretty structured environment, you get 3 meals a day and a place to sleep. You all wear pretty much the same clothes. You don't have any outside involvements. But other than that, the environment is incredibly chaotic and dangerous and noisy, and it's really it's completely dehumanizing in so many different ways. And most incarcerated folks are just trying to, a lot of them are just trying to kind of numb out so that they don't have to really experience being in prison as much as they can. And obviously, the purpose of a monastery or an ashram is very different from that, right? But I guess you could say there are some parallels. So, and it is what you make of it. I was lucky. A lot of people make the assumption that I discovered meditation while I was in prison, like some prisoners do. I mean, we have an organization, Prison Dharma Network, where we've been introducing prisoners to meditation for some 37 years now. But actually, I had been practicing for a long time. I found meditation, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, meditation, LSD, and marijuana all in the summer of 1966. Which was the summer after my sophomore year in high school. And the Summer of Love, the famous Summer of Love, but I wasn't in San Francisco, I was in Missouri, so I don't know how much Summer of Love was happening in Missouri. But at any rate, I got started early on and just trying to really learn meditation on my own for a long time. Then I ended up living as an expat in South America for quite a while. I went through the whole counterculture. I just went headlong into it. I graduated from high school in 1968. I was already pretty deeply into it already, but classic angry young man and very tumultuous year in U.S. society, the Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations, the Kent State killings. I mean, just a whole revolutionary time, especially if you were young. And so I just went headlong into the counterculture, and it went from the kind of psychedelic era into more hard drug use, and I got involved in all that. But I knew I knew that was a dead end. I wanted out, and so I'd always had this idea of going to South America and to Peru in particular, and nothing to do with drugs. I was looking to connect with something real in my life, something magical, the same kind of magic that I experienced when I was young. I remember my early childhood as being really awesome and magical and full of just vivid, and then around 5, 6, 7 years old, it just went to gray tones. I don't know whether that was just a natural developmental process or starting school. We had alcoholism in my family. Could have been my mother's alcoholism. But at any rate, I wanted that back, and that took me down a lot of twisted roads. But at any rate, so I left the States to get away from the hard drug culture. Also, Richard Nixon was reelected to a second term, and that just, I couldn't handle being in the country anymore. And I had this real strong polarized dualistic us versus them thinking going on, and so anyway, left. But I spent a long time living in South America, starting in 1973, I guess. I really started continuing trying to practice on my own down there through books and stuff. I finally heard about the founding of then Naropa Institute by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1974. There was a big spread in Rolling Stone magazine, and some travelers showed up at my place. It was in a remote valley off the Sacred Valley of the Incas in the Urubamba area, and they brought this copy of Rolling Stone magazine from the fall of 1974. It had this huge feature story spread about Naropa and Trungpa Rinpoche and Ram Dass and a whole big happening that happened there that first summer, where most of the seminal teachers that are popular now were all there. You know, a lot of, as well as the whole avant-garde culture, William Burroughs and Buckminster Fuller, all kinds of people. So at any rate, but what really attracted me was Trungpa Rinpoche. I saw his name, I just knew I had to go there. So eventually I managed to get up and check it out, and I decided to get a master's in what was then called Buddhist and Western psychology. It's now called contemplative psychotherapy. Not so much because I wanted to become a psychotherapist. That was my major in college, but it was more that I wanted to learn meditation and get deeper into that path. And I knew I needed structure and teaching as a teacher. So I did that, and finally managed to get up there and enroll in 1977, and ended up becoming a student of Trungpa Rinpoche and got very deeply involved in that path. But I was still, kept this shadow life where once or twice a year I'd disappear to South America and do a smuggling run. I was smuggling cocaine. Initially, I just started making connections down there. I could make $1,000 and live off that for almost a year when I was originally down there. But then coming back to the States, I got into some small-scale smuggling myself and justified it with all kinds of us versus them, stuff. And my marriage was falling apart just because my Peruvian wife really never assimilated being happy in the U.S., but also my crazy lifestyle didn't lend itself to. So anyway, I really take full responsibility for our marriage falling apart. But I was keeping those problems at bay. If I had money, I could live outside society more or less, not have to get a regular job. I have a separate place for my wife and son to live, and I was keeping my problems, and I knew it had to end. But before I managed to end it, I ended up earning my way into a federal prison sentence. But along the way, had been really trained with Trungpa Rinpoche for over 10 years, and not only deeply trained as a practitioner, but also as a teacher at the basic level. And I was spending about half the year in retreats and about half the year running around being this crazy smuggler person, right? And but when I got locked up in 1985, I turned myself in based on my teacher's advice, and I originally was sentenced to 30 years, no parole. I thought my life was over as I'd known it. I was 35. The paper next morning said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. And my son was 9 years old, and I was absolutely devastated. I just went through a really incredibly excruciating dark night of the soul, having to face what I'd done to my son, who was now going to grow up without a dad. And, I was pretty terrified about going to prison and, the whole thing. So I became radically dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life and taking the positive things I'd received from my family, even with the alcoholism. My family had good values with a lot of positive things, my education, and especially my teacher and all that training, and do something with it to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even his dad died in prison, because I had no surety that I would survive my time at all. And turns out that I was sentenced before 1987, which they call old law in the federal system. So back then you got a lot of good time. Now I was in prison a while before I figured all this out. But I finally figured out that if I stayed out of trouble, which is not easy to do in prison, I would serve 18 and a half on the if I kept a job and stayed out of trouble, I'd serve 18 and a half on the 30. And then when my appeal took 2.5, 3 years to go through the courts, and they dropped one count off an aggregate 5-count sentence, and that reduced my sentence to 25. And then I knew I'd serve 14 and a half, which still felt like forever. But that is what I ended up. I managed to stay out of trouble, and I served 14 years in the federal prison and then 6 months in a halfway house. And now I was on probation and various controls for another 10 years or so. But during that time, I just, I did take monastic vows with one of my Tibetan teachers, but I was just practicing like my hair was on fire, and I was, it was my main focus. But I was also teaching school. I had a day job, my 9 to 5, Monday through Friday job, helping other prisoners learn to read or get their GED or study for college classes and learn English. I got very involved in 12-step work, dealing with my own substance abuse issues, was a leader in that program for all those years. And then Started a meditation group in the prison chapel. They didn't want one, but I managed to get it started by hook or by crook, and led that group twice a week for 14 years. And
Right.
then I did my time at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, which is the maximum security federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri. And height of the AIDS epidemic, 1985, just really moving into the height of the AIDS epidemic. My men were being brought there from all the federal, maximum security federal prisons, and just in horrible conditions. So with another prisoner, I helped start their first hospice program in a prison anywhere that we know of. And then I started publishing and doing research around that, managed to start a nonprofit, and got that movement out. By the time I got out of prison, there were like 75 hospices in state and federal prisons due
Wow.
to the work we were doing. And I also had started Prison Dharma Network back then to get make meditation more available to prisoners who were incarcerated. So those two nonprofits started while I was in prison. So it was a very disciplined journey. It was I was just full on focused on transforming myself and trying to offer value to the community I was in. And any hope of having a life when I got out. I knew I'd be close to, once I knew I was going to serve 14 and a half, I was fortunate to stay out of trouble. I knew I'd be 50 when I got out, and I'd have a serious record, and I was going to owe the IRS a lot of money. And how do you start a life, right? So I knew I really had to train myself. And fortunately, that paid off, and I really had nothing but opportunities since I got out. But all
Wow.
the drug use stopped back then. And I was on probation for a long time getting out, and so I could, they could call me in to do a urinary analysis, a UA, anytime. And so, but I wasn't interested in getting, back into drugs. And so it wasn't, so my psychedelic exploration was between 1966 and maybe 1981, 82, probably last
Hmm.
time I did any psychedelics. And so that's quite a long time ago. And then it wasn't until recently, I've been following ever since I've been following this kind of emerging psychedelic renaissance, as people call it. And, initially seeing all the stuff going on in South America where I'd lived and very familiar with the culture there, and seeing all the stuff around shamanism and psychedelic. I have to admit, I was a little skeptical about some of it because I kind of know the culture and know the people down there, but I was
Hmm.
still interested in it. But it was really when I started seeing the research coming out of MAPS and other organizations of the profound impact that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy was having for veterans and others with severe PTSD. That really got me interested. And so I
Right.
started really paying attention, doing a lot of research into what was going on. And I found out there was this amazing movement, much more thoughtful than the movement I'd been involved in the 60s and early 70s, but a lot of nonprofit organizations, a lot of people really trying to do it right this time. There's all the
Hmm.
commercial stuff, as we know, but a lot of people trying to do it right. And that's what inspired me to put together our first psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy summit in 1982, I guess. 82, yeah, I think 82, right? So I'm sorry, long-winded answer, but that's the background.
There's so much context there, and so I just to keep the conversation focused and sort of driving, especially towards what you've built and created in your methodology. One thing that I learned as a phrase, this was neurosomatic mindfulness, which is
Uh-huh.
a trauma-informed approach to meditation. So I'd love if we could just start there for the audience that's listening. What is neurosomatic mindfulness, and maybe talk a little bit about how did your time, not only in federal prison, but also training in Boulder and training in meditation and going through what you went through, how did that inform the development of NSM?
Yeah. So I generally describe NSM as very deeply embodied, like almost radically embodied. There's a lot of talk about embodiment, and there's a lot of wonderful embodiment work out there, but this is like really radically embodied, neuroscience informed and trauma informed approach to classic mindfulness awareness meditation. And I've been practicing for more than 50 years, deeply trained in the Tibetan Vajrayana traditions, and especially in the advanced practices of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, formless practices. And then also in the Zen tradition, I'm a Roshi and empowered teacher in the Zen tradition, and so Shikantaza and other practices in the Zen tradition. But I've always been fanatically interested in everything meditation. So I've studied across every discipline you can think of, right? The Vedic traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, Sufi meditation, Christian meditation, Judaic meditation. I've studied all the different secular non-duals. I've studied with a lot of these teachers. I've read all their books. I've gone to retreats. So I've been a student of the art and technology of meditation for over 50 years. And so and I'm a synthesizer. I've always been synthesizing, right? When I got out of prison, I was taught at Naropa University in Boulder, where I'd gotten my degree before I went to prison. I came back there and taught for 10 years. And my classes were like laboratories for integrating and synthesizing all the work from my Tibetan tradition, from Trungpa Rinpoche, all the work from my Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, and then my study of all these different traditions and my fascination with neuroscience. I started just reading everything I could get my hands on, especially all the neuroscientific study around mindfulness and meditation and awareness practices, but other things as well. And so I've just been always integrating and synthesizing that. And my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, really emphasized embodiment, but I don't think I really got it with him as much. I should have, but, he really made a powerful distinction between what he called psychosomatic body, which is kind of the conceptual body made up of our thoughts and images and feelings and memories of body, and then what he called body. He made that distinction in his version of the four foundations of mindfulness, the first which is mindfulness of body. And so that's a strong distinction in him saying, how do we get below the conceptual level into the direct experience, the sensate experience of the body? Because our brain is set up to economize its energy. It has to, because we're being, we have trillions of bits of data coming at it all the time. And the brain's basic job is to filter out what you don't need to survive, right? What do you need to actually survive and meet your needs? The brain's filtering out everything else. So we're seeing this particular virtual reality version of actual reality. And so it's constantly economizing. So one of the ways that it economizes is it replaces direct experience with concept very quickly. And most of us really, until we kind of find ways to awaken from it, we live in this conceptual world. We're out walking around, we see a tree. Do we really see that living entity, the tree? Or does our brain very quickly just replace it with an archetypal image of tree or even oak tree or elm tree? But, we live in that kind of world in relation to people and even ourselves. Like, in meditation, you'll be trained to focus on the breath, for example. So mostly, until you learn to do otherwise, you're just focusing on the concept of breath. You may be directing your attention that way, but you're not really getting into the real direct experience. Now, why is this important? So most people, when they start to meditate, they struggle with a very busy mind, right? They struggle with this chaotic mind up there between their ears. And for most modern people, that's very busy and very discursive and very chaotic. And we know from the research around psychedelics that this has a lot to do with what's called the default mode network, which is active when we don't direct our attention. And if we do direct our attention to anything, that activates something called the task positive network. And those two are, at least to a degree, are mutually inhibitory, mutually antagonistic. So you bring the task positive network online, the default mode network starts to go offline. Now, not demonizing the default mode network, it has its place. If you can rid it of the fear and anxiety that pervades our mind and brain because of the survival nature of, life, as first job is survival. If you can rid it of that, it's a place of tremendous creativity, which is what happens with free association and psychoanalysis and other disciplines. Artists and creative people are constantly accessing that for creativity. But for most of us, it's so full of fear and anxiety that it's constantly producing this fear-based constant discursiveness and selfing and identity and opinion and, me and what others think about me and what I want and all that. So if you try to struggle with that directly and learn to meditate, it's just counterproductive. And I think most people that begin a meditation practice give up because it's just too hard, it's too boring, they're struggling with that racing mind. If you can instead activate the task positive network, especially in a continual way, that noisy mind just quiets down by itself. You don't have to talk, you just leave it alone. You just let it do its thing, but it starts to quiet down naturally because you're intensely focusing your attention, really yoking your attention with the direct felt experience of the body. And for me, it's the most powerful way to make that shift and to do it in a sustained way. So the mind really quiets down and it stabilizes, your attention stabilizes, and stable attention leads to deeper states of awareness, which lead to deep states of flow and what is called samadhi in Eastern traditions, and all the insight into the nature of experience, reality, and yourself that can arise out of that, right? And along the way, because our brain and nervous system is a learning machine, your brain and nervous system's learning how to do that. And you're getting, because you're so embodied, you're getting a lot of data. You're getting physical, emotional, and cognitive data of all kinds, sensory data. And so with any shift in posture, technique, anything, shift of attention, it changes the data. So there's this internal neurobiofeedback loop happening. And it's kind of already there, but you're awakening it and cultivating it more. So any kind of practice, any mind-body practice begins with some kind of effortful, intentional self-regulation of some kind. Like, standard practice, you focus on something, your mind wanders, you bring it back. Your mind, that attention switching, right? So it's effortful, it's intentional self-regulation. And over time, though, with this approach, your whole brain and nervous system and emotional body learns to do the practice on its own, and the practice becomes much more effortless. And you can move from effortful mindfulness, effortless awareness, effortful or mindfulness or awareness into effortless mindfulness, effortless awareness. And that's really important because to drop into the deeper states of meditation and meditative experience and the healing that can come along with that, you need to relax. So if there's effort, it just gets in the way. Or if you're trying to maintain your presence, you're trying to maintain awareness, I'm trying to stay with the breath, right? Any effort there is a block to the deeper states. So the more you train your own nervous system to learn how to auto-regulate into deep states, then that gives you access to these deeper states. And it also really accelerates the journey in so many powerful ways for new practitioners as well as experienced practitioners. So that's what neurosomatic mindfulness is all about. And, we found that it really integrates extremely well with various forms of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
Okay, so I'll take a step back. So I've done some training in Vipassana, so the 10-day Goenka retreat, which I've talked about in the podcast before. I won't belabor, but it's 10 days of silence, and they, the sort of core technique that I think they become known for is, I think after day 4, 3 times a day for an hour, you sit and you body scan, you don't move, right? That's sort of the invitation, because allegedly that's how the Buddha became enlightened. He said, I will sit here underneath the Bodhi tree until I become enlightened, and I will not move until that happens. And then I've also trained someone in the Zen traditions and kind of what those involve. You've mentioned Dzogchen, which is another lineage, more Tibetan Buddhist lineage. In terms of neurosomatic mindfulness, just to help kind of bring this a little bit deeper for the group, does that involve, body scans? Is it specific prompts or meditations? Are there invitations like with metta meditation, loving kindness meditation? There are prompts to, for certain mantras. How would you sort of define the maybe structure of NSM in terms of the way that it's initially offered, but then how it's also deepened into?
Yeah, so we do have a neurosomatic mindfulness approach to metta or loving kindness practice. And that's kind of a distinct, because in most basic mindfulness awareness practices, you're really allowing the mind to be as it is while training yourself to be fully in it, fully present with it. Whereas in metta practice, we're cultivating particular states, right? And you're really developing, I guess equanimity could be a state, but you're really developing an unbiased attitude towards whatever state is rising in the moment. Whereas metta practice is you're cultivating any kind of compassion, you're cultivating particular, and they're both very valid types of practice, just different. But the key in both with the neurosomatic mindfulness approach is the embodiment. So you mentioned the Goenka 10-day retreats, very powerful retreats. And in the Theravada tradition and in the Goenka method and the Vipassana method, there is a focus on the body and scanning the body and focusing on sensation, because it's understood that in the chain of what's in the Buddhist tradition called the 12 nidanas, which keeps this continual recycling of limited condition, reactive kind of birth and death and the cycle of existence in that way, that place of sensation is the place where you can break the chain. Also, to understand it in simpler terms, the second foundational mindfulness is feeling, but that's not emotions, it's feeling tone. So all physical sensations and all sense perceptions, emotions, everything, our entire experience is always arising across the spectrum from pleasant to neutral to unpleasant. And when some of that is pretty universal, and some of it has to do with our own conditioning, what we experience is pleasant, but when a pleasant experience arises, the mind of attraction almost co-arises. It's so fast. It's almost, but it's not simultaneous. But mostly we don't catch that at all. We're just in the attraction, right? And of course, attraction can go then onto clinging and into addiction and into all kinds of problematic behaviors. When things are neutral, like when we're just experiencing something that's neutral, we don't have anything to hang our head on, so we tend to go to sleep, right? The mind kind of gets dull, and so the mindset of ignorance arises. And then when there's unpleasantness, when we perceive some kind of sensory experience or cognitive, whatever it is as unpleasant, then aversion arises, almost co-arises, right? So we either want to push it away or we want to withdraw from it. So the place where you can really, and as soon as you go into attraction or clinging, into ignorance or into aversion, you're caught in the patterns of reactivity. You're no longer awake. You're just caught in habitual autopilot patterning of reactivity, right? So that is really a place where you can wake up to be able to distinguish there's pleasantness and then there's the clinging, there's the attraction, or there's aversion. There's unpleasantness and there's aversion. The hardest one to work with is neutrality and ignorance. It's very hard to catch that. But so the Goenka method is very much involved in that. And I would say neurosomatic mindfulness is similar in that way, except that's in service of going deeper. And so when you really focus on, and the focus is on feeling, and that's a distinction that I think it can be difficult for people to get. In fact, sometimes I introduce new people to these practices, and they go, "What do you mean feel? I don't feel. I don't. What do you mean feel my body? They're so. Most of us have been enculturated to live up in our heads so much. We have this complete disembodied culture, right? We're externally oriented, or we're caught up in the discursiveness up here. And sometimes I have to have people just like put your hand on a table or something, right? And just keep focusing and focusing there and focusing there until eventually you'll start to feel something. You'll start to get in touch with that sensate feel, and people, oh wow, there's this whole energetic thing there, right? So we start with gross physical sensation, and that focus on gross physical sensation, not just observing it, right? There's a pattern here. When we start practicing, originally before we practice, we're kind of lost in this river or soup of sensate experience, right? Without a lot of awareness. We have some where we couldn't function, but for most of it, we're just kind of lost in this ongoing river of sensate experience and cognitive experience without a lot of self-awareness. So the first step is to climb out of the river and sit on the riverbank and look back at the river. And now we can observe the river. We can observe all the hydrodynamics and the current and the eddies and whirlpools and things floating by, right? So that's kind of like where we begin with an awareness practice, right? So that's developing the observer or the witness mind, and it's a very important development because from that witness mind or witness consciousness, we can choose how to respond to the content of what's arising in our experience, right? So very powerful, but it's still essentially dualistic. We have a sense of subject. I'm here witnessing that. I'm observing that. So if it's the breath, I'm observing the breath. And so there is that dualism, which is where we start, not a problem, but we can go beyond that. And so the more we can stabilize and the less effort involved in being present through this deeply embodied approach where we're activating this internal neurobiofeedback loop, then we can relax that sense of a witness and drop more just feeling sensation, not observing it, but directly experiencing it. And then eventually, like take, for example, the breath. We could be observing the breath. I know I'm breathing because I can maybe feel my chest expanding, or I can feel the belly moving, or I feel the air across the nostrils. So I'm feeling somewhat, it's really just the brain is already just going breath, right? Or in breath or out breath, or, I'm not really in that sensate field. So then I begin to make this shift with instruction and guidance to really connect with the direct sensate experience of breath. Don't settle for breath. Like even sometimes there's a close placement mindfulness practice where you pay attention to all the sensations on the surface of the nostrils, right, as the breath goes in and out. You really try to catch the micro sensations. But very quickly, the brain is just going, breath, in breath, been there, done that, nostril, skin. Well, it's really takes effort to stay with the actual micro, genuine, actual sensations. And the power of that, not only is it activating the task positive network on a continual basis, but it's now because the direct experience of sensation is happening right now in the moment. But it takes some effort to really get into the actual sensation, right? So we move from observing the breath to actually feeling the breath, feeling not the breath, but feeling the sensations that make up the breath. right? And guidance, I always talk about there's no such thing as body, there's no such thing as breath, but these are pointing to moment-to-moment lived experiences, like the landscape of actual tactile physical sensation arising and falling away moment to moment, or at least appearing to do so, that we call body. That's what we're trying to get into, to feel that directly. And even then, there's maybe a sense of a feeler, right? But the more you stabilize, you can, over time, let go of the feeler and just be the breath. Just be the body. So you're moving from more dualistic into more non-dual practice in that way. And you start off with gross physical sensation, right? The most we can think, we think the touch is pretty substantial, pretty tactile, and internal touch feels pretty, but if you close your eyes and start doing it immediately, it feels kind of more like energy. But at any rate, you go through that gross physical layer, but as your awareness deepens, you're going deeper and deeper into that sensate field. And you're going from gross physical sensation to subtler and subtler and subtler physical sensation to subtle body. You're getting into the what science doesn't really have too much of a handle yet on, the inner channels and the subtle body. And along the way, you're getting more in touch with the emotional body. And you keep going, you go all the way into the most profound levels of being, right? Which in some sense are beyond body at some point, but the way you got there is through the body. So as you're getting into the most powerful expanded states of awareness that are available to us as humans, you didn't do it by just popping, not to put down psychedelics, but you didn't just pop a pill to get there, or you didn't do a few moments of intense breath work. You've trained your whole nervous system and brain how to get there, and now it's completely reshaped your neural architecture. It knows the way there. It can get there very easily. It knows how to abide there. And so your experiences along the ways you're doing it, it's already integrated. And it's already completely reshaping who you are and how you experience your life, right? So for me, it's the most efficacious way to go deep in meditation, but it also handles the whole integration process along the way because you're literally changing your brain and your nervous system.
Yeah, this relationship between mindfulness and the nervous system is something that we've explored, and I'm becoming increasingly interested in. Psychedelics also seem to have a similar impact, where they create, as you said, these neural grooves, or this new neural architecture of what it feels like to be in a parasympathetic state, a state of total rest and relaxation, of surrender, of receptivity, of openness. And they've even done some really interesting clinical research, I believe at Johns Hopkins, with brain imaging, where they've compared the brain of a monk who has meditated for 40 years and someone who is on a high dose of psilocybin. And they've shown there's pretty substantial overlap in terms of what those brains look like. And so we in the podcast before, we talked somewhat at length about this relationship between psychedelics and meditation, but I'd love to hear the nuance of what is this relationship between psychedelics and neurosomatic mindfulness in particular? Why is it that you think these are really great when integrated together? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So, we don't really fully understand the mechanisms of healing and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy yet, but one candidate, and there is research and data to support it, is this suppression of the default mode network, right? Default mode network, it seems if the default mode network starts to go offline, our brain is kind of reorganized in a way that we start to have access to all kinds of transpersonal experiences and transpersonal states, right? And so we know that to a degree, different psychedelics operate in different way, but to a degree, most of them are suppressing the activity of the default mode network in some way, and mindfulness and meditation also do that. So there's a commonality, and researchers in separate research trials involving both of those have gotten together and discussed this, and that's been going on for a while. So this approach to mindfulness is going to provide a continual suppression of the default mode network in ways that regular conventional mindfulness practices do not. It just goes much deeper and creates the possibility of having not only continual, but non-effortful continual. In other words, you've trained your whole nervous system and brain that your attention and your awareness can rest in that ongoing activation of the task positive network, and you just have a much more spacious, much more quiet mind in an ongoing way. It's not like any of us can do it. I mean, you can make that shift. Just imagine like trying to thread a needle, right? For a moment, just you lick that thread to get a fine point. You're trying to get through the eye of that needle. For a moment, your mind gets really quiet. You can't sustain it, but it gets very quiet. So with regular mindfulness practice, we can cultivate the state of mindfulness in the moment. But when we stop doing the technique, generally we're going to default back. Now, we know even with basic mindfulness training like MBSR, over time, if you practice, your baseline mindfulness will increase. But, with these embodied practice, we're talking about going a lot deeper than that. Secondly, and a lot of my work now around this in terms of the neuroscientific relationship to it is with what's called network neuroscience, understanding the interaction of various neural networks in the brain. And there's 5 in particular I'm focused on. There's many, many neural networks in the brain, and it's important to say the brain is one holistic, interdependent enterprise. And there are discrete neural networks. You can think of it almost like a circuit board of byways or pathways or highways. And at the same time, there's another level with the brain is kind of this flow of energy. And you can map it out that, it's this very fluid flow. So it's kind of both are true. Having said that, there's many neural networks. The 5 of them that I'm focused on are the attention network. Obviously, you're training the attention network. And when we talk about training these networks, it means they're becoming more robust, right? More interconnection, more dendrites, more neurons, more, you're turning a faint little path that people start cutting the corner in a park or something. And now you decide to pave it and put lights on it. It's a really well-paved, so the more you access it, the more you train in it, you're developing a robust neural network there. So by doing any kind of attention training, you're making your attention network more robust. The second one is the task positive network. The more you activate that, the more continually it becomes more robust, and it can stay activated. It has its own abiding momentum, right? And that allows for this the default mode network being offline except when you need it or you want to activate it, right? Then next one is the self-regulation network. And this is the ability to regulate our own autonomic nervous system, right? And that happens natural with mindfulness awareness techniques, but you can also intentionally do a lot of breath regulation work. And I do a lot of breath stuff, and we include a lot of breath work in NSM, right? And so the more you regulate your autonomic nervous system, that network becomes much stronger. You have much more increase in vagal tone. You're much more likely to have a well-balanced parasympathetic state that's abiding, and because you've literally changed your brain, right? So that's 3. Then the 4th one is the emotion regulation network, which is connected to the self-regulation network, but is a separate network. And these are all interconnected in a certain way. But the emotion regulation network, and we know the tremendous amount of science saying that all these meditation, mindfulness, awareness practices actually increase our capacity for emotion regulation, increase emotional intelligence, increase emotional balance. And also we know that the deeper our interoceptive awareness, our access to the internal sensate landscape of the body, the deeper that goes, the more our capacity for emotion regulation and emotional literacy and intelligence and wisdom is increased, right? That's current neuroscience. So that's 4. And then the 5th one is the empathy connection circuit. And it turns out that doing these first 4, naturally, even if we're in a cave somewhere, is going to increase our capacity for empathy and connection. The more embodied we are, the more relational we are, right? But then we can also do relational practices and improve our listening and really be focused on being embodied and listening and present as we're interacting with others, and we can further train it. So these 5 networks, they're all interconnected, and there's a synergistic impact. So increasing the robustness of these 5 networks through practice, it's not just 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. It's more like equals 105 or 1,005. You get this synergistic thing. And if you can imagine someone who's really attentive, they're focused, their mind's not scared, the opposite of ADHD, I guess, right? And they're generally in a well-regulated state. They're not getting triggered. They're not bouncing all over. They're well-regulated. They're emotionally balanced. They experience their emotion. We're not talking about suppressing emotion at all. We have complete access to the richness of our emotional life, but we're not getting hijacked by our emotions. And our mind is very spacious because the task positive network is activated most of the time. and we're very relational. Like we're just ready to be in relationship, and, if somebody who's really that way at a pretty level of certain mastery of all that, it starts to sound like something like being an enlightened being, right? Now, it may not be. It may just be highly self-actualized. Maybe there's some nonlinear tipping point into what's called full enlightenment. Who knows? But nonetheless, in terms of our human journey of becoming more self-actualized and, being at our best self in terms of how we engage in life and show up, it can be pretty advanced. And we now know how to stack various body-mind practices to get there, right? And it doesn't have to take 30 years in a cave. I mean, if you can just go sit on a cushion somewhere for 30 years, a lot of this will happen, but that takes a long time, and you'll probably give up along the way. But now we can target, and this is kind of where the psychedelic can come in. But I'm working a lot with what I call practice stacking to create stacks of different body-mind practices and experiment with which one you do first or after the other, how long you do this, how long you do that one. I have an hour practice stack I experiment with every morning, as well as my hour and a half of my Tibetan Vajrayana practice. And they've been stacking practices for a couple thousand years. But this one is more the modern tech version, right? And so you can cultivate yourself into, really profound states. And the more time you spend in these states, and whatever you're trying to cultivate, profound gratitude, appreciation, forgiveness, equanimity, bliss, love, the more time you spend in these states, you're transforming your neural architecture to have more access to these states. So imagine slipping into that mix some, some ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or psychedelic or psilocybin, or in different titrated ways, in different amounts. In some cases, a psycholytic dose while you're actually meditating, or in some ways you do this kind of praying I've just been talking about, like do that for a full morning, and then in the afternoon do a traditional ketamine-assisted psychotherapy experience, or perhaps an MDMA or psychedelic or psilocybin where that could be legal. But so that's the idea of integrating. And we found the first retreat I did integrating Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy was at Ron or Amani Carson's retreat center in Nebraska, and I facilitated it with Gita Vade, my colleague and friend, who's a well-known ketamine-assisted psychotherapy expert and psychoanalyst. And we found that by doing the prep work of this deeply embodied work of Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness, which included the basic meditation I was describing with breath work and various things, all different elements, and then going into even low-dose ketamine experiences, people were having profound experiences on the ketamine, much more so than you would normally see with that kind of dose, because they were already sort of prepped for it on all kinds of different levels. And then we'd go back into the Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness work, and there's a natural integrated process. So we did that, and that was a very short kind of pilot retreat. And we've developed a model to do 5-day retreats. We hope to do one at some point this year. But that's kind of the idea.
And so with these, the 5 networks, just to review that, it's the attention network, the task positive network, the self-regulation network, the emotional network, and the empathic network?
Empathic connection network. Right.
Empathic connection network. So those are the 5 networks that neurosomatic mindfulness can open up and activate. And what I'm hearing is when we're doing work with psychedelics, it can impact very similar networks. I mean, we also, in some of the conversations I've had with neuroscientists, we've also talked about, you mentioned the default mode network, the salience network is another network that is often discussed and talked about. And so knowing that relationship with those 5 networks, it almost feels like, when we take a psychedelic or work with even a low dose of a psychedelic, it just, as Dick Schwartz would say in IFS language, it sort of lowers these protective parts or protector parts, which allows self energy to be more present. And when self energy is more alive and more present, we, I think, have a greater capacity to feel the sensation of what it is to exist.
Yeah, and there's several parallels there. We talk about in psychedelics and meditation and mindfulness, this suppression of the default mode network is one thing. But we're also, Robin Carhart Harris talks about how we access what he calls this Goldilocks zone, right? Between where the brain will go, it'll either go into rigidity or chaos, right? But there's a Goldilocks zone of ideal neuroplasticity. So we know that psychedelics can do that on a state basis, right? It can put us in these states, but you don't stay in that state. Now, having experienced that state, there may be some benefit, and there may be some change in the brain, and you may be able to find your way back there. But in general, it's going to take repeated psychotherapeutic sessions or something integrated with that. Otherwise, you have to keep taking the psychedelic to access the state. The thing is, with neurosomatic mindfulness, you're really literally rewiring your brain to have access, and then you're augmenting that with a psychedelic, right? So I think the possibilities of going from state to trait much more quickly and seeing really lasting change and integration from psychedelic experiences is really ramped up that way. And also, I love Dr. Dan Siegel's work, and the window of tolerance is a great way to understand how we're gradually healing trauma and expanding that window of tolerance. And we start off with a completely expansive one when we're infants, and it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks over a lifetime. With trauma, it shrinks every more. So these experiences, we're expanding that window of tolerance, a zone of resilience, and reclaiming a much greater bandwidth of our life, even the really, really challenging stuff, to be able to be in a relational best self mode with the most challenging stuff in life. So he also talks, though, a lot in his books and his research about how if you look at the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry, whatever people think about diagnosis, I think it's questionable, but nonetheless, all the disorders described in there, they're either disorders of chaos or disorders of rigidity, right? And that's the same, just like Robin Carhart here is saying, that's the way the brain goes, right? And so there is a zone in between, which he talks about, this river of having a well-integrated brain where your brain is becoming more and more complex to handle more and more complex problems, but it's also really interconnected and it's communicating really well. So there's flow, there's integration. And when we're in that river of flow, that's also where we're most neuroplastic, and that's where change can happen. Whereas when we get triggered into either chaos or rigidity, then we're not. So I think ideally the approach of neurosomatic mindfulness is creating a neural architecture that has more and more ability to really stabilize in that flow and abide in that flow, and becomes less and less possible, maybe eventually, albeit almost impossible, to get triggered off into chaos or rigidity. And then psychedelics, I think, can enhance maybe that experience or accelerate in some way, the combination of the two. But I think the ideal is that we have a way to integrate it. We access the state, but then we have a way to integrate it.
Yeah, and there's something about, you mentioned chaos and rigidity, right? One thing that Robin has talked a lot about is how the sort of mechanism of action as to why psychedelics are so effective at treating a range of conditions, anxiety, depression, OCD, even PTSD, is because it does have a positive impact on rigidity in particular. As you mentioned, though, that if done at too high of a dose, or there are too many high doses done over a short period of time, that can cause a sort of destabilization or desynchronization that is not accretive in the long term. And so a lot of this is the sort of hormetic aspect of how do you introduce enough chaos, but that is sort of, it's like working with pottery. It's massaged in such a way where you actually, it doesn't become overly rigid and break, but it's just in that sort of middle way is, I think, what the Taoists would call it.
I get your point, but I think rather than introducing enough chaos, I think we're introducing enough fluidity. Enough fluidity,
Yeah, I love that. I was just teaching this morning with our microdosing experience, and I introduced the concept of, the Chinese elements. They have 5 elements, and the element of water, right? There's something about the element of water and how that moves through that psychedelics and mindfulness open up. It's like going with the flow is kind of a common phrase to describe that.
Yeah, and as I think I mentioned before, I was away from psychedelics for long, probably from I don't know when my last psychedelic in that era was, probably somewhere around 1981, maybe 82, maybe at the latest. So, almost 20, 40, it's been 40 years or so.
Right.
And then I did an IFS ketamine retreat with Dick Schwartz and the founder of Internal Family Systems in sunny Strasbourg. And that was the first time I'd done any psychedelic substance since, in 40 years. And then since then, I've done another retreat with Sunny, where we did ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but then also 3 ayahuasca journeys, right? So that was my kind of reintroduction to that world. And my ability to be with those experiences was profoundly different from my memory of back then. I mean, way
Hmm.
back then, I mean, I don't know how many psychedelic journeys I did. I'm sure I did at least 500. I
Wow.
was pretty wild into it. In the States, into mescaline and psilocybin and LSD, and I don't know how many. I was pretty much of an extremist, and then when I lived in South America, I got deep into what's called San Pedro or
Yeah.
Wachuma, which is mescaline, but different than the peyote cactus.
Hmm.
And so, I had a lot of really profound trips, but I also got very destabilized times. I had a couple really rough, bad trips on LSD. In retrospect, I learned a lot from them. They were basically ego death experiences I wasn't prepared to handle.
Hmm.
And then I was doing so much of the San Pedro in Peru and Bolivia that for a period I got really destabilized. And I remember I was kind of running around with this old guy from Greece who was a filmmaker, and we were doing a lot of trips together. And at some point he said, I had a little farm, well, up high in the mountains of Peru. He said, you got to go back there and just work the farm, because
Hmm.
I was living in some really ephemeral world. And, I had to literally go work the earth so that trees would be trees and rocks would be rocks again. I was living on another planet practically. And I was attracting all kinds of weird energy. I'd gotten very destabilized, right? So I feel, uh, now that I have a whole different brain, body, and nervous system to have those experiences through, so that the whole situation feels, I mean, like ayahuasca is very, very intense experience, and even ketamine at higher doses is a very intense experience, but it's still quite different. The whole situation feels much more stable for me, even when you can't keep track anymore. In psychedelic
Hmm.
experiences, you often reach that moment where you're either going to stop and try to hold on, which is going to create panic, or you just let go and let it go, right? And at some point you have this moment, am I coming back from this, right?
Right.
That thought almost always arises, and you just have to, okay, well, whatever, and so, but that whole journey feels much smoother and stable for me, I think, as a result of the grounding and practice and really having a different brain and body and nervous system to which to have these experiences.
Well, your story is reminding me a little bit of Terrence and Dennis McKenna. They were in South America in the 70s, I think
Mhm.
more in Colombia, the upper Amazon, doing various
Mhm.
experiments with psilocybin and the I Ching to try to create what they called, I believe, time zero or zero time, this sort of
Mhm.
portal. It sounds like you landed though a little bit more than they did, and I'm not surprised in that because of the sort of backing that you had at the farm and the meditation. But there was something about that period in time. Andrew Weil, we've also had in the podcast, and he was also in South America
Mhm.
around then, exploring psychedelics and ayahuasca and whatnot. So
It was a very adventurous time back there. There weren't any retreat centers back then.
right,
If you
exactly.
I never
Yeah.
ended up doing ayahuasca while I was down there, which was kinda I always thought was ironic. I could have and aspired to it, just the situation just never arose. 'Cause I had some friends that did, Peruvian friends and a couple of Westerners. But you basically had to go down in the jungle and,
Right.
meet some indigenous people, finders, and it was pretty dicey. I mean, you might be welcome and maybe not so welcome. I mean, it was you were just really walking up into the jungle and see what happens, right? And I was adventurous enough to do that. It's just the timing never worked out. But I was really focused on the Wachuma, and doing that on a very, very, very regular basis for quite a
Mm.
long time. And at some point, I just became way too ungrounded.
Mm.
And yeah.
Mm. Well, Fleet, thank you so much for taking the time. I know it's 5:30 where you are. It's end of your day. You do, I know you are planning more retreats at the overlap of ketamine and neurosomatic mindfulness. We will post more details in terms of a website. You have fleetmaull.com. That's Fleet, Fleet, Maull, Maull, fleetmaull.com. Any other places that you'd like to point folks, maybe the Heart Mind Institute or any other spots that you
Yeah,
think
for
folks...
sure, Heart Mind, because that's where all our summits and online courses are. And, we do summits on the integration of neuroscience, ancestral wisdom, and current science, basically. We have Rewiring Your Brain summits. We have Expanded States of Consciousness summits, the Psychedelics Psychotherapy Summit, Resilience summits. We have a summit coming up on somatic healing. And in July, we have a replay of our Expanded States of Consciousness that has something like 90 speakers, covers the whole breadth of how human beings have been accessing expanded states over the millennia, which includes psychedelics, but also breath work and chant and ecstatic dance and meditate, all kinds of things. But at any rate, heartmind.co, heartmind.co, people can find all that. Yeah.
So fleetmaull.com, heartmind.co. We'll post more details. Like I said, Fleet will be hosting a more publicly available retreat at the overlap of ketamine and Neuro-Somatic Mindfulness. Fleet, I appreciate you joining us for the Psychedelic Podcast today. It was a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Paul. A pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complementary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.